Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that honestly sounds straight out of science fiction, but I promise you it's very, very real. We're talking about a massive paradigm-shifting approach to how we understand and treat mental health. If you've ever felt like the way we handle severe anxiety is just kind of stuck in the past, well, you're definitely going to want to pay close attention to the data we're unpacking today. We're looking at some truly groundbreaking clinical research on how psychedelics, specifically psilocybin, might actually dissolve fear right at its source in the brain.
All right, to really grasp why this is such a big deal, we got to start with a staggering number, 284 million. That is the estimated number of people worldwide currently living with diagnosable anxiety disorders. And to be clear, we aren't just talking about everyday warrior, pre-presentation jitters. We are talking about debilitating, life-disrupting fear that the brain literally just cannot turn off. It's the single largest category of psychiatric illness on Earth.
And here is the real tragedy of our current status quo. 50%, roughly half of all patients who try first-line treatments, things like SSRIs, benzodiazepines, or cognitive behavioral therapy, they just don't find lasting relief. They fail to get better. For hundreds of millions of people, our absolute best medical tools are essentially a coin toss.
But then we look at this number, 80%. In 3 rigorously controlled clinical trials, a single session of psilocybin produced an 80% sustained remission rate in patients facing severe anxiety. No way, right? I mean, let that sink in for a second. The clinical data is absolutely clear. We're not asking if this matters anymore. The real question we're exploring today is, how exactly does it work?
Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1, the anxiety epidemic and the broken brain. So, to understand the cure, we first have to understand the illness. Anxiety is not a character flaw. It's not a lack of courage. It is a mechanical failure in the brain's fear circuitry. Picture the amygdala as your brain's threat detection hub. It's the alarm system. In an anxious brain, this alarm is pathologically elevated. It is constantly blaring even when there's absolutely no real danger. On the flip side, we have the medial prefrontal cortex, or MPFC. This is supposed to act as a cognitive brake to regulate and shut off that alarm. But neuroimaging shows us that in anxiety disorders, the connection between these two areas is severely weakened. The anxious brain quite literally has a broken brake.
This broken circuitry leads to something neuroscientists call extinction failure. Normally, when a threat passes, the brain learns that things are safe again. That's extinction learning. But an anxious brain really struggles to form and consolidate these new safety memories. And actually, this is exactly why treatments like exposure therapy so often result in relapse. The brain might learn that a stimulus is safe right now, but the underlying fear memory, it's never truly suppressed. It just waits in the background, completely exhausting the person carrying it.
Section 2, the 4 mechanisms of psilocybin. Let's break down exactly how this compound fixes this broken neural architecture.
So, how in the world does a single dose of a psychedelic compound fix that? Well, researchers have identified a high-level roadmap of 4 distinct mechanisms. Psilocybin essentially attacks anxiety from 4 different angles. It activates specific serotonin receptors, disrupts the brain's rumination networks, directly enhances how we learn safety, and triggers a profound psychological shift. Let's look at these one by one.
Mechanism 1 is 5-HT2A activation. Unlike traditional SSRIs, which just chronically manage the daily availability of serotonin, psilocybin hits the 5-HT2A receptors incredibly hard, but for a short period. These receptors are densely packed right in that broken brake area of the prefrontal cortex we talked about. This acute stimulation triggers rapid structural neuroplasticity. It physically promotes the growth of new synaptic connections, basically rewiring the prefrontal amygdala axis so the brain can finally hit the brakes on fear long after the drug has actually left the system.
Moving on to mechanism 2, which involves disrupting the default mode network, or DMN. Think of the DMN as the network responsible for your internal monologue. In an anxious brain, it is chronically hyperactive. It's that endless, exhausting loop of worry and what-ifs. Psilocybin dramatically silences this network during the experience. Researchers call this a window of plasticity. It forces those deeply entrenched, rigid thought patterns to just lose their grip, giving the brain a much-needed chance to breathe and reset.
Mechanism 3 is direct fear extinction enhancement. Remember how we said anxious brains fail to learn safety? Well, psilocybin upregulates a vital protein called BDNF in the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex.
You can think of BDNF like miracle grow for the brain. It massively accelerates the formation of safety memories, so the therapeutic processing a patient does during and after a session is consolidated so much deeper and faster than in conventional therapy alone. The brain finally learns how to let the fear go.
Now, what's really fascinating here is mechanism 4, the mystical experience. This part isn't just biological, it is profoundly psychological. Across all these clinical trials, the intensity of this mystical experience, which patients describe as a feeling of unity, transcendence, and profound insight, is actually the single strongest predictor of lasting anxiety relief. Confronting this massive shift in perspective seems to completely reorganize a patient's entire relationship to fear, survival, and even their own ego.
Section 3. The proof. Landmark clinical trials.
Okay, so that's the neuroscience and the psychology. But what happens when you put this into practice with real people? Let's step away from the theory and look at the actual clinical proof. This evidence has been building steadily. It all started in 2011 with Charles Grob's pilot study at Harbor UCLA, which showed durable anxiety reduction in cancer patients. Then came 2016, a total watershed year. Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins published a massive trial where 65% of patients showed complete anxiety remission at 6 months. And simultaneously, a completely independent team led by Stephen Ross at NYU found the exact same thing. 2 different teams, 2 different cities, identical, remarkable results.
The statistical result of all these trials boils down to this math equation: an effect size of D greater than 1.0. Now, if you don't read clinical journals over breakfast, let me translate that for you. It is math that equals hope. This effect size is nearly double what we see with traditional daily antidepressants. It is quite literally among the largest single-session therapeutic effects ever recorded in the entire history of psychiatry.
Section 4. Safety, contraindications, and the future.
Now, as mind-blowing as all this sounds, we absolutely have to look at the clinical realities. This is not for everyone, and it is certainly not something to be taken lightly. Physiologically, the safety profile is incredibly strong. Psilocybin is non-addictive, there's no known toxic dose in humans, and it completely clears the body in 6 to 8 hours. However, the psychological risks are very real. Patients can face incredibly challenging, even distressing experiences during the session. That is exactly why it's absolutely contraindicated for individuals with a history of psychosis, schizophrenia, or bipolar disorder. And it highlights why this treatment relies entirely on heavily supervised, structured clinical settings with trained professionals.
And this brilliantly illustrates the complete paradigm shift we're talking about today. For decades, our standard of care has been SSRIs, managing brain chemistry, requiring a daily dose, and unfortunately, failing 50% of the time. The new paradigm with psilocybin, it isn't about managing chemistry at all. It's about rewiring neural architecture. It requires only 1 to 2 sessions total, and so far it boasts an 80% success rate in these controlled trials.
But we have to remember this absolutely vital quote from the researchers. The psychedelic is the catalyst. The therapeutic support is the container. Psilocybin is not a magic bullet you just take at home to cure yourself. The profound neuroplasticity it triggers only turns into lasting healing because of the rigorous psychological preparation and integration that frames the entire experience. The therapy is just as important as the molecule itself.
Which leaves us with this final thought. The data is clear. The mechanism is understood. The trials have been replicated over and over. So the question isn't really whether psilocybin works anymore. The question is, are we, as a society, ready to move from simply managing the chemistry of our anxiety to finally rewiring the architecture of our fear? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope this sparked your curiosity and leaves you wanting to learn more about the incredible future of mental health.